Greetings sailors and welcome back to All Warships and Patreon supporter spotlight number 81. This is possibly going to be a bit of a low energy video because I've been struggling for 4 days or so and counting to make this one happen so far, but I've gotten as far as this point at least now, so hopefully it won't be 5 days or 6 days. That would be pretty bad for a single video. Obviously it's all of the amazing special effects and editing and all the post work that goes into these that takes the time up. Yeah, it's not just my crummy brain or anything like that. So we're kicking this off with PointyHairedJedi in the Dunkirk, which is a ship that you see all that often, and I think it really does count as one of those premiums that you play only if you particularly like it. And it does have its fans, but because the dispersion isn't especially great and because the caliber is kind of small, it's only got some fans. It's a bit of a niche ship really in that regard. It's I won't call it a hipster ship exactly, but you do require some good fortune in order to have a good result, along with actually playing well as well. It at least has a fast-ish rate of fire these days, and it's also just fast as a ship. It has got a good velocity and pen on the shells, so it's not like it doesn't have some things going for it. And in fact, in this particular game, as PointyHairedJedi pointed out in the email, the AA is even going to do a bit of something, although it is only against a tier 6 carrier. AA has never been particularly a strength of this ship, mainly because of the nature of the dual purpose mounts. I don't know if those are a bit better onto the current AA regime, but one of the big issues with having a lot of your AA concentrated in so few secondary mounts was that if they get knocked out, you lose big chunks of AA power at once. Anyway, so far so good. Citadel already, and he's not taken too much damage in return. He's also got some nice, lovely broadsiding ships to fire at. The Graf Spee to start with, and now this Ismail, who really isn't using their armour to any kind of optimal angle, but as it turns out, PointyHairedJedi obviously thought they were going way faster than that. That was massively overcooked. So yeah, that was rather further ahead. That was like a whole ship length ahead of where the Ismail actually was. There is one tier 7 in this game he has to worry about though, as you can see, the Giulio Cesare there. It's a commonly known and long-standing bug that for some reason it displays as being as a tier 5 battleship, but anyone that's actually played against it knows that it is in fact a tier 7. Yes, well, it can feel like that when you're facing one a top tier or even a tier 6 anyway. Still a lovely broadside on Ismail, and let's hope his leader's a little bit better this time. It looks like he has slightly more correctly calculated, and yep, there we go, double Citadel. He's about doubled his damage with that. Hopefully the Ismail learns their lesson. It actually starts to angle a bit more, but you never know. With some players, learning lessons doesn't really seem to be a thing that they do very well. They just keep doing the same things over and over again, regardless of the consequences, and like a broken clock, occasionally they will be correct, but most of the time they just get paddled, and then wonder why they get paddled. In this case, though, the Ismail has actually, backed off a bit, not just sailing broadside forevermore, although one does wonder how much of that was being shot at and how much was the fact that if they had just kept going in a straight line, they'd have hit the map border. Who knows? So back to the Graf Spee, who is a rather more tempting target, and they take an absolute hammering. I'm not entirely sure what they were thinking there. That is not particularly good angling for that armour. Maybe they were thinking the Gida would shield them with the smoke, but they've been air spotted, and of course the debuff chance for those 11-inch guns when you're firing through smoke is pretty high. You don't get the benefit of smoke that a lot of cruisers do. And although they did put torps out, and although they really did just have the range, the speed and manoeuvrability of this ship meant that Peretzkeny was quite easily able to dodge out of the way. Heck, they might not even have been the Graf Spee torps, they might have been Gerda torps, I don't know. I think Gerda has slightly longer range torps. Or does it? Is it 8 kilometres for the Gerda? Or is it 7.5? I can't remember. I know it's 8 kilometres for the Graf Spee. I haven't played my mid-tier German destroyers enough. But it's like I was saying in that last video, there's now enough ships in the game that it's not so simple a task to remember all the relevant stats these days. For me personally, it's a lot easier if I've actually played through the lines extensively, but there are a lot of lines now where I've played them a bit here and a bit there, but not a lot, and there's still some lines that I haven't even really touched at all. So back to broadside shots at the Ismail, and really they could do with all the advantage they could get at the moment, because although they have 2 of the caps, the enemy team is slightly ahead on points, although not so much as to get worried about, but that's not a trend you want to let continue. You want to basically, in this kind of situation, not let the enemy team get too far ahead at all, because at that point things can really snowball, especially if they're ahead as a result of kills. But so far it's only 1 kill each, although with that shot, again against the broadside Ismail, who apparently didn't want to learn about angling at all, then yeah, that's evened things nicely. So that puts them back on an even footing in terms of ships, and also puts them ahead now on points. He's also giving some AA cover to his div mate here, and that Vesteros as well. The AA isn't completely awful on this. You know, it never was completely awful compared to some of the other tier 6 ships, but there weren't that many tier 6 ships that you could say had good AA. One of the few under the old regime was the Queen Elizabeth, which could have 4 tier 6 pretty god tier long range AA DPS. But these days, of course, things are rather different. So yeah, maybe the like I was saying, maybe the mid-range DPS just is worth a lot more these days. Now, he could have gotten the gap between the 2 torps and instead tried to turn outside them completely and took one on the belt, but that's not such a big issue right now. He's still got lots of health to work with. And of the enemy ships he's facing, there's not a lot that can actually overmatch his armour. There's only that Queen Elizabeth potentially, which isn't quite as scary a proposition as, say, a Warspite. And it doesn't look like they're even trying to hit him at all at the moment. So he can just chill to some extent and drop torps now that he knows, not drop torps, keep firing now that he knows there aren't any enemies nearby that will drop torps. My brain skipped ahead part of a sentence there, as it likes to do. Bow on against the Cesare, he really doesn't have that much to worry about. I mean, they could try switching to HE shells. It's only if he gives broadside himself that the Cesare becomes a particular threat. But they are themselves, again, not particularly angling, so yeah, this is one of the reasons why this is going to turn out to be a good game. He's going to get all of the broadside battleships to take pot shots at. And you kind of need that advantage for the high damage numbers at the low and mid tiers, because you don't have the big overmatch potential that you start to get from tier 7 and 8. Now, that's one of the annoyances of old with this ship. It's not quite so bad these days, but yeah, one of the things that this doesn't have, unlike its real life counterpart, is the ability to keep firing even if the turret gets partly penetrated. It was one of the features of French battleships, which I know I've mentioned before, but it's been a while since I've covered the Dunkirk. So yeah, if you are unaware, basically they separated the turret to 2 compartments, so that in theory frontal penetrations, if they weren't too devastating, would only knock out half the turret. The other half was kind of protected by an armoured wall through the centre line of the turret. But there's not really a mechanic for half of your turret to keep firing in this game, so yeah, it's either all or nothing really, and it's still possible if you take enough disabling turret hits, or even just an outright disabling shot that turns it black, to have your Dunkirk turned into a giant torpedo, because it can't really do anything else. It's not like it has amazing secondaries, and of course the secondaries are mostly pointed towards the back as well. Anyway, that's the Cesare dealt with. He also got a very nice chunk of damage out of the Ranger. Fortunately, during all this, the Fuso, which did have lovely shots at his broadside for part of that, and I think PointyHairedJedi was well aware of it, but just decided to take the risk because clearly they weren't paying attention to take advantage. Yeah, he was able to just hound that Cesare down, and now he can turn around and get a bit of extra damage out the Fuso as well. And at this stage they've basically won. They're over 900 points, and PointyHairedJedi is almost at 150k damage alongside a high caliber. If you can do a bit more on the Ranger, that would be nice, but he's got a limited amount of time to do it with. Yeah, I don't know what happened there, if that was just a replay thing or if that was a ping spike on his end, but it wasn't particularly welcome. It's cost him a precious, if small, amount of time, and yeah, he could have maybe had that shot away a little bit quicker, but in theory he still had time for that final shot to land. It just didn't, sadly. So 144k, 13 plane kills, showing it's not completely terrible, although it's not, that AA is not going to have anyone particularly quivering in their boots. But him and his divisional mate placed 1st and 3rd, with their allied Ranger being in 2nd place, which is actually not bad going for a carrier these days. And overall that was a pretty good game, but it was more one of those games where you're taking advantage of enemy players playing quite poorly. But it was still an impressive result even so, just if nothing else from watching the Dunkirk guns behave themselves enough to give a reliable series of Citadel shots, which is not always the case. But at least you never have to worry about penetration with these guns, even if they are lower caliber, unlike some of the other guns that you get at this tier, which are lower pen, like for instance on the Normandy, which can feel rather underperforming by comparison. So we go from small guns to big guns. This is the Georgia at tier 9 with tier 8 guns, and this is Redman, who is actually technically not a patron anymore. This is me kind of doing a, like, he was due a replay in the series anyway, so he's kind of getting a farewell replay here, as it were. Hopefully, you know, this is me, you know, not at all shilling for my own Patreon channel or anything, but hopefully by the time he is able to, he gets back to civilization and is able to start supporting me again, he will choose to do so. But of course, you know, that's the whole idea behind Patreon, is it's entirely voluntary for people to support whether they want to or not, and that's fine. That actually puts me in possibly a slightly more secure position than a lot of self-employed people in a lot of countries at the moment. The inevitable spectre of COVID-19, of course, is sort of looming over everything at the moment, and we've actually now had our first reported cases here in the Western Isles. It's somewhat behind the rest of Scotland, but it kind of feels somewhat inevitable that it was going to happen. But here in the UK, at least, the support the government is offering for self-employed workers doesn't really kick in until April. Not April, June. I'm getting my months mixed up there. So yeah, there's a bit of a wait, but I am in a relatively fortunate position with Patreon. Not so much with YouTube. You know, ad rates have slumped again. doubtless because of advertisers pulling their ad budgets to try and save money. But yeah, the continued generosity of my patrons is making such frivolous things as paying for my internet and heating and rent and food possible. But yeah, Red Man in particular, I mentioned he's going off into the wilds. He's actually... I'm hoping I'm alright to say this. I don't know why I wouldn't be, but I found it kind of interesting. He's off on supposed to be off on a research trip to the Canadian Arctic, but it got kind of postponed because the captain of the ship he was going to go on had to go into a precautionary quarantine. So I don't know what the status is at the moment. I think he's still at home for the time being, but yeah, being on a ship, I immediately thought of Jingles' many years in the Royal Navy, and so I advised him, take a laptop full of games, that'll keep you sane, because it's not going to be a huge number of people he's going to be with. So definitely some diversionary entertainments while he's away will be good, and if nothing else, he's getting a bit of practice of quarantine and isolation just now before he goes off onto a small ship to do it even more. But hey, he's getting paid well to do it. And I'm sure he'll get to see some fairly spectacular scenery along the way as well. Not that I'm jealous or anything. Although some would say the scenery where I live is quite nice also. In fact, it's probably one of the main draws of living where I live, is that it's really quite pretty sometimes. Although, not always. Sometimes it's just downright miserable. That's going to be one of the big impacts, by the way, here. Tourism is a huge industry here throughout the summer. It's one of the kind of main seasonal sources of income. So things on the islands are not too bad overall for the time being, although a lot of shops have had to close. But once we get towards May, June, if things are still kind of locked down or semi-locked down by that point, then it's really going to start to bite, I think. But hopefully by that point a lot more people will be able to access government help. So I can't really speak as to other countries' response, but the UK government is... they've been doing sort of all right. I think the criticism that can be levelled against them is much more around their planning prior to this. Things like a couple of years ago, the previous one of the previous Conservative secretaries of health was responsible for turning down a plan the NHS in England and Wales put forward towards stockpiling suitable quantities of protective equipment, including things like face masks and all the full everything that might be needed in the event of an outbreak such as the one we're having at the moment. And he basically went, nah, that's too expensive, and went for a much cheaper option instead. And then of course there's things also like the 10 years we've had of effective cuts to health funding under Tory-led and then pure Tory governments, which are undoubtedly going to have a huge effect on how well the NHS copes with this overall. I mean, that is one of the big things at the moment, is scrambling for equipment and making sure that there are sufficient bed spaces set up for potential people that need treatment. So yeah, it's all a bit kind of scary and everything at the moment, but it's the same for everyone really. And can't help look at the news from places like India, for example, where the health infrastructure is much less good and they're going to have a much harder time. Or even the US. I have friends in the US, and frankly the response in the US seems completely all over the place. The governors in some states seem to be being a lot more sensible than the governors in others, and of course the less said about the national leadership at the moment, the better, probably. It would probably help if the person that's nominally in charge of the US federal government didn't keep standing up and telling such obviously disprovable porcupines. That doesn't tend to inspire a lot of confidence. I got a bit sidetracked there, didn't I? But it was sort of inevitable. Anyway, yeah, this is turning out to be a bit like the last one so far. I mean, the enemy team are ahead on points at the moment, but that doesn't mean to say that things are actually looking that bad. I mean, that's a nice chunky shot that Red Man got just there. His secondaries are also opening up on this Musashi, who is... yeah, they're pulling into view in a very broadside manner in a Musashi. That's going to be potentially very nice. But yeah, the enemy team has basically been pushed towards the northern end of the towards the northern end of the map, and they're now in the process of reclaiming the middle. So this is actually looking like it's solidly turning around in their team's favour. But you know, overconfidence can be a bit fatal, so let's not call it just yet. Up to a very healthy 91k damage, and this Musashi is just asking for punishment. They really are. I have to wonder if that's kind of some S&M thing at this point, to be quite honest. What did you think was going to happen, Musashi? What did you think was going to happen? Oh dear. Anyway, so that's a nasty set of enemy guns out of commission, but that Benham is quite close by. I mean, we can see the Benham smoke just there, and the Benham itself is a very dangerous little ship, as I'm sure people are well aware who have encountered it firsthand. Just the number of torpedoes and the reload it gets are really very nasty. And personally, if this was me, I think I'd have risked a speed boost at this point. But as it turns out, it's not actually necessary. He gets kind of lucky with his timing a bit. I mean, he was manoeuvring, so he wasn't going in a straight line, which is absolutely the correct thing to do. But still, having the speed boost available, I think that would have been the safer course of action. So it's getting a bit hammered by planes here. I mean, this is a double carrier game. I didn't even mention that, but that's always unpleasant. Although slightly less unpleasant when you're in a battleship with strong AA and in the middle of a group of other ships. So he's getting the benefit of this cluster of AA here, which is the sensible thing to be doing right now. And at this point, they also do just have the enemy team completely on the back foot. Their responses ended up being pretty fragmentary to this push towards the middle that Red Man's team have made. So, unless something goes spectacularly wrong, unless ships start detonating, or unless that Benham starts racking up some spectacular numbers of kills, which is going to be pretty hard for them to do with two carriers in play. That's a fairly hard counter to any kind of destroyer in this game. Then yeah, this is looking now like they very much have the forward momentum here, and Red Man can possibly afford to be a little more aggressive. Not too aggressive. It would be entirely possible to overextend like the enemy Alsace is doing, but yeah, as long as he doesn't get too far away from his allied ships, so he loses the benefit of having their AA cover as well as his own strong AA, then he should be fine. This Alsace, on the other hand, just seems to have decided, screw it, I'm going to get some damage. We've lost. Not even going to bother trying to be sensible at this point, and that just means extra damage for all concerned. Now, they're low health. I wonder if perhaps the rather notable secondaries of this ship can... oh, there it is. It's not like I knew in advance or anything. It's not like I've seen this replay already or anything. Why would you think that? Anyway, so that's another kill, and this time with the secondaries, which have landed a fair few hits, just generally speaking. And now another broadside ship to take a pot shot at. Well, let's see if he manages to aim, and if RNGesus is kind, although it seems like the answer is no, but he might have some additional chances, although somebody else actually got a good hit in there as well, so not a lot of damage left to get out of the Donskoy, but he might at least get the kill. He's now starting to run a bit low on health himself, though. He's actually used all his heals at this point. So he's got to be a little bit careful, but yeah, he's doing alright overall. I mean, as long as he doesn't get horrifically focused, then he should be okay. And even if he does get horrifically focused, oh, there we go. Yeah, it's not like they're going to lose at this point. It might be possible, but it would be pretty hard. There is enough time, theoretically, for the enemy team to bring this back. But, yeah. One of the enemy carriers, in fact both the enemy carriers are now spotted. The Venom is not completely neutralised, but they're going to have a hard time of it with the carriers trying to spot them. And overall, yeah, it's looking like this one's pretty well won. If I can say anything about the carriers, actually, it's that their own carriers could have moved up significantly by this point and had a far shorter turnaround on their planes. But as it is, they're quite far to the south. So there goes the Shikaku, which puts them even closer to victory. The North Carolina is probably not going to sustain any massive hits at this angle. So the one enemy battleship we've seen in a game today, particularly, that does seem to be angling with any degree of proficiency. And barring any last-minute miracles, yeah, I don't think this is going to be lost somehow. I really don't. I think Redman was playing it a bit cautious around the Venom, but yeah, that's understandable. Didn't want to lose his ship at this point. But at this stage, yep, there's the points going up to the max. So that was air defense and close quarters, high caliber, and a dreadnought. Unsurprisingly, 187,000 damage done, and we'll see in a second how much of that was from his secondaries. He only had 4 fires, but they may have burned for a decent duration, so some of the fires may have contributed quite a lot to that final score of 2,279. But we shall see in just a second. And 31k, that's not bad, and 13k from the secondaries. So the secondaries themselves didn't do a huge amount of damage. Possibly he doesn't have IFHE then, but the fires on that, on top of the 140k-ish done with the main batteries, made for a nice top-up. So overall, that was a pretty good Georgia game. Played a little bit cautiously to start with, but I mean the alternative would have been, I don't know, recklessly charging into that first cap, I suppose, and probably dying in a hail of gunfire. So it was absolutely the right thing to do. I almost said accidentally the right thing to do. I don't know, it might have been. No, Red Band's a half-decent player. Well, half-decent. Wow, he's definitely not going to support me anymore on Patreon after this. That's a thing, right? If I just insult people that give me money, that works for... That must work for somebody somewhere. Howard Stern. I don't know, is Howard Stern still a thing? I have no idea. Anyway, I'd better wrap this up before I accidentally insult anybody else. So, yes, hopefully quarantines and everything are finding you well. Wash your hands. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And, as always, stay tuned for more.